Have you ever wondered how a single moment, a fleeting decision, can alter the course of a life? Not in some dramatic, world-changing way, but in the quiet, unexpected corners of existence where real change begins? Most of us walk through life assuming that kindness must be grand to be meaningful, that if we can't fix everything, we might as well fix nothing. But what if that isn't true? What if the smallest, most unremarkable act, the kind that takes no more than a few minutes, that asks for nothing in return, is the very thing that changes everything? Sarah Mitchell didn't wake up that Christmas Eve expecting to rewrite someone's future. She didn't plan on knocking on Harold Benson's door, but she did. And because of that one simple act, the course of both their lives was rewritten in ways neither of them could have imagined. So here's a question. How many lives do we pass by each day, completely unaware that we might be the only person who has a chance to change them? And more importantly, will we take that chance? The wind howled softly through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant fireplaces burning warm against the winter chill. Snowflakes fell gently from the dark sky, settling on rooftops and tree branches, cloaking the town in a pristine white blanket. The streets shimmered under the glow of Christmas lights, golden and red, flickering merrily from every window. Laughter spilled from houses where families gathered around their trees, the scent of roasted turkey and spiced cider thick in the air. But at the far end of Maple Street, where the houses stood grand and historic, there was one home that remained untouched by the season's joy. A towering Victorian mansion, its shutters drawn, its windows dark. No wreath adorned its door. No twinkling lights hung from its eaves. It sat in stark contrast to the world around it, as if time itself had abandoned it. Sarah Mitchell pulled her coat tighter as she walked past, her breath curling in the cold night air. She had lived in Willow Creek long enough to know the stories about the house and the man who lived inside. Harold Benson. The name carried weight, though it had been years since he had been seen in town. Once, he had been a powerful figure, a business magnate whose wealth had shaped the very streets she now walked. But tragedy had a way of stripping even the strongest souls bare. After losing his wife and only son, Harold had shut himself away, turning his back on the world. No one visited, no one dared, and over time, he became little more than a shadow in his own home. Sarah slowed her steps, her eyes drawn to the porch. There he was. An old man sat hunched in a rocking chair, his silver hair neatly combed, but his face lined with years of solitude. He stared out at nothing, his hands folded in his lap, his coat buttoned up to shield against the cold. But it wasn't the cold that left him looking hollow. Sarah had seen loneliness before, in the quiet, forgotten corners of nursing homes, in the tired eyes of people who had lost everything. And now, she saw it in Harold Benson. A lump formed in her throat. She didn't know him, not really, but something about the sight of him sitting there, alone on Christmas Eve, made her chest ache. She could have kept walking. Most people did. But something deep inside her wouldn't let her. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. The man on the porch didn't move. He barely seemed to breathe. Sarah turned on her heel and headed toward the small diner at the corner of the street. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The warmth of the restaurant a stark contrast to the freezing night outside. The scent of fresh bread and coffee wrapped around her, and for a moment, the familiar hum of conversation filled her ears. "Sarah," a voice called from behind the counter. She looked up to see Grace, the diner's owner, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you in so late?" Grace asked. Sarah hesitated, glancing at the trays of food still waiting to be served. "I need a meal," she said finally. "Something warm. To go." Grace raised a brow. "Bit last minute for Christmas dinner, isn't it?" Sarah offered a small smile. "It's not for me." Understanding flickered across Grace's face. She didn't ask any more questions. Instead, she disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned with a steaming container of pot roast, buttery mashed potatoes, and roasted vegetables. "Cocoa too?" Grace asked, already pouring the rich, chocolatey drink into a paper cup. Sarah nodded. "And do you have anything small I can wrap up?" "A little gift," Grace pursed her lips, thinking. Then, she reached under the counter and pulled out a tiny box wrapped in gold paper. "One of the regulars brought a bunch for the staff," she said with a shrug. "You can have this one. I won't tell." Sarah took it, warmth spreading in her chest. "Thank you, Grace." Grace waved her off. "Whoever it's for, I hope they appreciate it." Sarah stepped back out into the cold, the warmth of the diner fading behind her. She hurried back up the street, the bag of food tucked safely under one arm, the cup of cocoa warming her hands. When she reached the porch of the Victorian house, the old man was still there, still staring at the snow-covered street as if lost in some faraway thought. Sarah took a deep breath and knocked. The sound echoed against the empty silence of the house. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Harold Benson turned his head. His sharp, weary eyes locked onto her, and the weight of years rested in them. He stood, his movements deliberate, and stepped to the door. When he opened it, the warm glow from inside barely reached the cold night air. "Whatever you're selling, I don't want it," he said, his voice flat, his expression unreadable. Sarah smiled, lifting the bag slightly. "I'm not selling anything, Mr. Benson." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I just thought, no one should be alone on Christmas." His gaze flickered between her and the food, his fingers curling against the edge of the door. "And what do you expect in return?" he asked. "Nothing," she said softly. A long pause. The wind whispered between them, carrying the distant sound of church bells ringing midnight. Harold exhaled, a quiet, tired sigh. "Come in," he said finally, "before you freeze to death." The door creaked open just enough for a pair of sharp, weary eyes to peer out into the cold. They landed on Sarah with a mixture of suspicion and irritation, flicking briefly to the bag in her hands before returning to her face. His expression, carved from years of solitude, was unreadable. "Whatever you're selling," Harold Benson said, his voice rough from disuse, "I don't want it." Sarah met his gaze, steady and unflinching. She had expected resistance. Men like Harold, men who had spent years fortifying themselves against the world, did not simply lower their walls overnight. But she had also spent years working with people who had lost everything, and she knew that sometimes even the hardest hearts were just waiting for a reason to soften. "I'm not selling anything, Mr. Benson," she said gently, lifting the bag slightly. "I just thought, no one should be alone on Christmas." Harold's grip on the edge of the door tightened. He glanced again at the food, the steam still rising in the freezing night air. His jaw tensed, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might slam the door in her face. But then, something flickered in his eyes. Hesitation, uncertainty, maybe even curiosity. A long pause stretched between them. Finally, Harold exhaled, a deep, reluctant sigh. Without another word, he stepped back, pulling the door open just enough for her to enter. "Come in," he muttered, "before you freeze to death." Sarah hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around her like a thick blanket, a stark contrast to the biting cold she had left behind. But despite the heat radiating from within, there was something unmistakably hollow about the space. The grand hallway stretched before her, its high ceilings adorned with intricate molding, its hardwood floors gleaming under the dim light of an ornate chandelier. A place built for wealth, for gatherings, for life. And yet, it felt frozen in time, elegant but lifeless, as though it had not truly been lived in for years. No Christmas decorations adorned the walls. No scent of cinnamon or fresh pine filled the air. It was a house trapped in silence, untouched by the season's joy. Harold closed the door behind her and walked ahead without a word. Sarah followed him through the house, her boots barely making a sound against the polished floor. They entered the sitting room, where a fire crackled softly in the massive stone fireplace. The only light came from its flickering glow, casting shadows that danced across the walls. A heavy armchair sat positioned near the hearth, its cushion slightly worn, as if it were the only piece of furniture that had been used in years. Harold lowered himself into the chair with a quiet groan, his movements slow but steady. He gestured toward the seat across from him. "Sit," he said simply. Sarah set the meal down on the small table between them and took the offered seat. "It's not much," she admitted, opening the bag, the scent of warm food filling the room. "But it's hot." Harold said nothing at first. He simply stared at the meal, as though unsure of what to do with it. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he picked up the cup of cocoa and took a careful sip. For the first few minutes, silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Harold ate in quiet contemplation, his gaze flickering to Sarah every so often, as if trying to decipher her presence in his home. Finally, he set his fork down and leaned back in his chair. "No one's brought me Christmas dinner in years," he murmured. Sarah offered a small smile. "Then it's long overdue." He let out a quiet huff, something between a scoff and the ghost of a laugh. He shook his head, staring into the fire, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest of his chair. "I used to hate Christmas," he admitted after a long pause. "Not always. There was a time when it meant something." His voice dropped slightly, as if speaking the words aloud made them heavier. "My wife loved it. She decorated the whole house. Trees in every room, garlands on every railing. She baked enough cookies to feed half the town." A small, wistful pause. "My son used to wake us up at the crack of dawn, too excited to sleep. I used to think those were the best days of my life." Sarah listened, not interrupting, not offering empty condolences. She knew better than to say, "I'm sorry," to a man like Harold. Instead, she let him speak. His fingers curled slightly against the armrest. Then they were gone, and Christmas just became another day on the calendar. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Outside, the snow continued to fall, the world beyond his windows softened by winter's quiet embrace. Sarah reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small wrapped box, setting it gently on the table beside him. Harold frowned at it, his brows knitting together. "What is this?" Sarah shrugged. "Just a little something." He stared at the gift for a long moment. Then, instead of unwrapping it, he placed it beside him on the armrest of his chair, as if he wasn't sure what to do with it. Sarah didn't press. She knew some things couldn't be rushed. She stood, brushing her hands against her coat. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said softly. "I know this probably wasn't your plan for tonight." Harold exhaled, his gaze still on the fire. Neither was Christmas. Something in his voice, something so raw and quiet, made her heart ache. But she said nothing, only nodded. She turned toward the door, but before she could step away, his voice stopped her. "Miss Mitchell." She looked back. Harold's expression was unreadable, his lips pressed into a firm line. But there was something different in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. "Thank you." It was only 2 words, but Sarah knew what they meant. For the first time in years, Harold Benson had shared a meal with someone on Christmas Eve. And for the first time in a long time, he hadn't been completely alone. Sarah smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Benson." Then, she stepped out into the cold, never expecting that in just 1 hour, her life would change forever. The night was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Sarah wrapped her hands around a warm cup of tea, letting its steam curl up toward her face. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the streets in a fresh, glistening layer. She had just returned from Harold Benson's house, and though she hadn't expected much from the evening, something inside her felt different. Lighter. She had seen something shift in Harold's eyes tonight. Something small but significant. A flicker of warmth where there had once been only coldness. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe by morning, he would retreat into his solitude once again, pretending the night had never happened. But for one night, at least, he hadn't been alone. She sighed, setting her mug down on the counter. Kicking off her boots, she ran a hand through her hair and glanced at the small Christmas tree in the corner of her living room. It was nothing fancy, just a few lights and ornaments she had collected over the years. But it was enough to make her apartment feel like home. A sudden knock at the door shattered the quiet. She jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Who would be visiting at this hour? Frowning, she set her cup down and moved toward the door, cautious. She glanced at the clock, just past midnight. Peering through the peephole, her stomach tightened. Two men stood in the hallway, dressed in dark suits. Lawyers. She hesitated. Nothing about this made sense. She didn't know much about Harold's affairs, but why would lawyers be knocking on her door in the middle of the night? Taking a steadying breath, she unlocked the door and opened it just enough to see them clearly. The older of the two, a distinguished-looking man with silver-streaked hair and a sharp navy coat, offered a polite but firm smile. "Miss Mitchell." Sarah's grip tightened on the doorknob. "Yes. My name is Jonathan Hughes. I'm Mr. Harold Benson's attorney." He gestured to the younger man beside him, who gave a small nod but remained silent. "I apologize for the late hour, but Mr. Benson has asked to see you immediately." Sarah blinked. "Harold?" Jonathan nodded. "Yes." He said it was urgent. A flicker of unease curled in her stomach. "Urgent? Is he all right?" she asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "He's fine," Jonathan assured her, "but he insisted we come straight here." Her thoughts spun in circles. Harold had barely let her through his door earlier. What could possibly be so important that he had sent his lawyers to fetch her in the middle of the night? She hesitated, glancing between them, trying to read something in their expressions. Jonathan's tone was professional, but there was an underlying weight to his words, something that told her this wasn't a request she could ignore. "Let me grab my coat," she said finally. She hurried inside, shrugging in her heavy wool coat and slipping her boots back on. Her mind raced. Was this about the meal? The gift? Had she done something wrong? The thought was ridiculous, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. A few minutes later, she stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind her. Jonathan led her down to the street, where a sleek black sedan idled at the curb, its exhaust curling into the frozen night air. The driver, dressed just as sharply as the two men, opened the back door as she approached. The car's interior was warm, the leather seats plush beneath her as she settled in. The moment the door closed behind her, the vehicle pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly through the quiet streets of Willow Creek. The town looked different at this hour. Empty, still, the snow-dusted roads illuminated only by the occasional street lamp. The Christmas decorations that had looked so warm and inviting earlier now cast long, flickering shadows against the buildings. Sarah stared out the window, her thoughts swirling as fast as the snowflakes outside. What was Harold thinking? She replayed their conversation in her mind, searching for any hint that might explain why he had sent for her. But there was nothing. Just an old man with tired eyes, drinking cocoa by the fire. Just a small, gold-wrapped gift left unopened on the armrest of his chair. Just a quiet thank you that had lingered in the air as she walked away. The car took a slow turn onto Maple Street. Her stomach tightened as the towering silhouette of the Benson mansion came into view. It looked exactly as it had earlier that night, dark and looming against the snowy backdrop. But this time, as they approached, she noticed something different. Light. A warm glow flickered from the windows of the sitting room, casting golden streaks against the falling snow. Jonathan stepped out first, making his way up the front steps before knocking once on the heavy wooden door. Almost immediately, it swung open. Harold Benson stood in the doorway, his face illuminated by the firelight behind him. His tired eyes locked onto hers, and for a long moment he just studied her. Then, without a word, he stepped aside. "Come in." Harold led Sarah through the dimly lit hallway, his steps slow but steady. Something about him felt different now. Earlier that evening, he had looked like a man weighed down by the years, by memories too painful to hold but impossible to let go of. Now, there was something else in his expression, something sharper, more certain. The fire in the sitting room burned brighter than before, casting flickering shadows along the polished wooden floor. The same grand armchair sat facing the hearth. The same antique books lined the towering shelves, but the space didn't feel quite as lifeless as it had before. Harold gestured for Sarah to sit, then lowered himself into his chair with a quiet exhale. For a long moment, he said nothing, staring into the flames, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest. Then he spoke. "I haven't trusted anyone in a long time." Sarah shifted in her seat, waiting. His voice was calm, but there was something raw beneath it, something that had been buried for years. After my wife passed, I still had my son, he continued, eyes fixed on the fire. And I thought that would be enough. But when I lost him too, he trailed off, his fingers tightening slightly. I learned the hard way that people only see what they want to see. And when you have money, they don't see you at all, just what they can take from you. Sarah didn't speak. She let the words settle. All the so-called friends I had. Harold let out a dry chuckle. They disappeared overnight. I became a story people told. Harold Benson, the old man in the big house who lost everything. And eventually, I stopped correcting them. He turned to look at her, because they weren't wrong. Sarah swallowed, unsure what to say. Harold studied her for a moment before shaking his head. But tonight, he said, his voice quieter now, you showed up. Not because you wanted anything. Not because you knew who I was. You knocked on my door, gave me a meal, and sat with me when you could have been anywhere else. Sarah's chest tightened. That's rare, Harold said simply. Jonathan, who had been standing near the doorway, stepped forward then. He carried a thick, official-looking envelope and placed it carefully on the table between them. Sarah glanced at it, then back at Harold. Harold took a slow, steady breath. I don't have much time left, Sarah. She stiffened. What do you mean? He gave her a knowing look. Doctors won't say it outright, but I know. You get to a certain age, and you can feel in your bones. He tapped his chest lightly. My time is running out. Sarah's stomach clenched. Harold, I've spent years preparing for it, he interrupted. Making arrangements, going over my will, redrafting it, then redrafting it again. Because for the longest time, I couldn't decide who to leave it to. A cold weight settled in Sarah's chest. Jonathan cleared his throat. Mr. Benson's estate is valued at approximately $70 million. The words didn't register at first. The number was too staggering, too impossible. Harold gestured toward the envelope. Until tonight, that will sat and signed, he said, because I had no one I trusted enough to leave it to. Sarah's fingers curled against the armrest. I'm leaving it to you. The words hit her like a shock of ice water. She blinked. What? Harold smirked faintly, watching her reaction. You heard me. No, this has to be some kind of mistake, she stammered. I barely know you. Harold chuckled. Exactly. And yet, out of everyone I've met, you were the only one who saw me as more than just a name. Sarah shook her head, her pulse hammering. I can't accept this. Harold, I can't. You can, he said simply. Her breath came unevenly. This is insane. I wouldn't even know what to do with all of it. Harold leaned forward then, his expression softer now. I do. She frowned, still reeling, but he held her gaze steady. I know you, Sarah. I know you won't waste it. You won't hoard it, or use it to make yourself untouchable. You'll do what I never could. Sarah swallowed hard. Jonathan cleared his throat again. Mr. Benson has outlined specific allocations in the will, but the majority of the estate would be yours to manage as you see fit. She barely heard him. Her mind was spinning. Harold studied her carefully, then spoke again, quieter this time. Sarah, he said, if this money wasn't for you, but for the people who need it most, what would you do? The words sank deep into her chest. She thought of the families she had worked with, parents struggling to put food on the table, elderly people with nowhere to go, children growing up without stability or warmth. She thought of the moments she had sat across from them, wishing she could do more. Her entire career, she had fought to help people with so little. She had spent nights worrying about resources, about funding, about how to stretch every last dollar just a little further. And now, sitting across from Harold Benson, she realized she was being given the one thing she had never had before. A chance. She exhaled shakily, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached out, running them lightly over the envelope on the table. Harold leaned back, waiting. Sarah closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. She already knew the answer. I'd help, she whispered. Harold smirked. Then it settled. Silence stretched between them as the weight of Harold's words settled. The fire crackled softly, its warmth filling the room, but Sarah's hands remained cold. Across from her, Harold watched, waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to accept what he had offered. A lifetime's worth of wealth, built and hoarded, now placed in her hands. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "I'll do it," she said at last. "But on one condition." Harold raised a brow. "Oh, and what's that?" She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "You're coming with me." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "Excuse me? No more hiding in this house," she continued firmly. "No more shutting the world out. If we're doing this, if we're really going to use this money to help people, you have to be a part of it." Harold let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" "So I've been told." He exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "Sarah, I'm an old man. My place isn't." "It is," she cut in. "Your place is exactly where the people need you. Where we need you." Harold studied her, something unreadable in his expression. Then, slowly, a smile, small but genuine, pulled at the corners of his lips. "All right," he said finally. "We do this together." The transformation began in the days that followed. The once empty mansion, which had stood as nothing more than a monument to the past, began to fill with life. It started small, files stacked on Harold's old desk, papers spread across the sitting room table as Sarah researched charities, community programs, and local shelters in desperate need of funding. Harold, to her surprise, threw himself into the work. At first, it was with the same careful detachment he had always carried, as if waiting for the world to betray him once again. But then, little by little, something changed. He began reaching out, calling old business connections, meeting with community leaders who had long assumed he had vanished. People were skeptical at first. Harold Benson, the man who had spent years locked away in his estate, was suddenly attending meetings at town hall, speaking with nonprofit organizers, even walking into the very shelters he had once ignored. The town whispered about it, some convinced it was a passing whim, an attempt at redemption too little and too late. But then the change became real. The Christmas Kindness Foundation was born. Its mission was simple: no one should be alone. No one should be forgotten. The first initiatives focused on those who had been most overlooked: families on the brink of losing their homes, elderly individuals with no one left to care for them, shelters struggling to provide even the most basic necessities. Small grants were issued to struggling households, ensuring no child would wake up to an empty kitchen on Christmas morning. Housing assistance was established for seniors left behind, providing warmth, security, and dignity in their final years. Shelters that had been operating on the verge of collapse suddenly found themselves fully stocked, with blankets, coats, fresh food, and enough funding to keep their doors open. And Harold, the man who had once shut the world out, stood at the center of it all. He walked through food banks, shaking hands with volunteers. He sat in community centers, listening to stories of those who had been left behind. He stood in front of the very people he had ignored for years and asked, "How can we help?" The town, once skeptical, began to believe. They saw Harold at work, truly at work, and the whispers began to change. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't about reputation. It was about something deeper. A man who had spent his life building an empire of wealth had finally realized that the greatest thing he could build was hope. And for the first time in years, Harold Benson had a purpose. Snow fell in gentle waves, blanketing Willow Creek in a soft white glow. The town shimmered with golden lights wrapped around lampposts, flickering candles in windows, and garlands draped along storefronts. Laughter rang through the streets, mixing with the distant sounds of carols and the bells of the old church tower marking Christmas Eve. At the end of Maple Street, the grand Victoria mansion no longer sat in darkness. A year ago, Harold Benson's house had been nothing more than a shadow in the town, a relic of the past, sealed away from the world. Now, it stood at the heart of something far greater. Long tables stretched across the once empty lawn, covered with steaming plates of food, trays of warm bread, and stacks of carefully wrapped gifts. String lights wove through the trees, casting a warm glow over the crowd that had gathered. A crowd that, just a year before, would never have set foot on these grounds. Elderly couples sat beneath heated tents, their hands wrapped around cups of cocoa as volunteers draped soft blankets over their shoulders. Families who had once struggled to put food on the table now shared warm meals with strangers who had become friends. Children ran between tables, their laughter filling the air as they reached for treats from baskets held out by smiling volunteers. And at the very center of it all stood Harold Benson. He was dressed in a thick coat, his silver hair dusted with snow, his eyes sharper than they had been in years. A man who had once spent his Christmases in solitude now stood surrounded by life, by warmth, by a town that had, in its own way, welcomed him back. Sarah watched from a few feet away, taking it all in, the transformation, the miracle of it. She had believed in Harold's vision from the moment he placed that envelope in her hands. But even she hadn't imagined it would grow into something this big, this meaningful. She saw Harold crouch slightly as a tiny girl, no older than 6, tug at the sleeve of his coat. He turned, lowering himself to her height, and smiled. A real smile, one that softened the lines of his face. The little girl held out a small package wrapped in brown paper, her mittened hands barely able to contain her excitement. "This is for you." Harold hesitated, as if unsure what to do with it. "For me?" She nodded eagerly. "Mommy said you help a lot of people, so I wanted to say thank you." Harold's fingers trembled slightly as he took the package, unwrapping it carefully. Inside, nestled in the folds of tissue paper, was a small, hand-painted ornament, shaped like a heart, painted bright red, uneven in spots, but made with love. Harold blinked, his throat tightening. The little girl beamed. "It's for your Christmas tree." Harold swallowed, his gaze flickering to Sarah. He hadn't had a Christmas tree in years. Sarah grinned. "You have one now." He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Of course I do." The little girl giggled, then threw her arms around Harold's waist in a quick, warm hug before running off to join the other children. Harold watched her go, his fingers tightening around the ornament. Sarah stepped beside him. "You okay?" she asked softly. He exhaled, still staring at the little gift in his hands. "I never thought I'd get another Christmas present." She nudged him lightly. "Get used to it." Harold's fingers brushed over the tiny heart one more time before he carefully tucked it into his coat pocket, patting it lightly, as though afraid to let it go. His eyes lifted then, sweeping over the scene before him. The fire pits glowing, the people gathered, the warmth that pulsed in every corner of the estate. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think my wealth was my greatest asset." Sarah glanced up at him. "And now?" Harold smiled, his eyes warmer than the fire burning in the hearth behind them. "Now, I know," he said, voice steady, "the greatest gift is having something worth giving." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Instead, she simply reached out and squeezed his hand. "Merry Christmas, Harold." Harold covered her hand with his own, his grip strong, steady. "Merry Christmas, Sarah." And as the snow continued to fall, as music and laughter filled the air, Harold Benson, the man who had once been forgotten, finally knew what it meant to be home. In a world that moves so fast, where days blur into each other and the holiday season often becomes a whirlwind of shopping lists, travel plans, and celebrations, it's easy to forget the small moments that truly matter. The ones that don't come wrapped in ribbons or glittering with lights. The ones that don't cost a cent, but hold more value than any gift money could buy. Sarah never planned to change anyone's life that Christmas Eve. She didn't set out to make a difference. She simply saw an old man sitting alone, and something inside her told her that wasn't right. So she stopped. She knocked on his door. She brought him food, shared a conversation, and reminded him, without even realizing it, that he was still part of this world. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't carefully orchestrated. It was simply kindness, freely given, with no expectation in return. And yet, that one small act set off a chain of events that neither of them could have predicted. How often do we pass by someone in need? An elderly neighbor who hasn't had a visitor in weeks. A veteran sitting alone in a cafe, watching the world go by. A widow spending her first holiday season without the person they loved most. It's easy to assume that someone else will step in, that someone else will notice. But what if that someone is supposed to be us? Harold Benson had spent years locked away in his own loneliness, not because he wanted to be alone, but because he had convinced himself that no one cared enough to knock. Until one night someone did, and that changed everything. This holiday season, I challenge you, just as Sarah challenged Harold, to step beyond your comfort, beyond the distractions of daily life, and reach out to someone who might be alone. It doesn't have to be something big: a warm meal, a genuine conversation, a simple reminder that they are seen, that they matter. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness lead to the most unexpected miracles. And who knows, maybe that miracle is waiting just behind a door that only needs a knock.